Eremos topos. That's a phrase in Greek that means desolate, lonely places. It's used to describe the kind of places that Jesus would go to pray. You know, if abiding in Jesus as disciples involves learning to walk in the same manner he walked, we won't get very far down the path without realizing how important prayer was in his life. Jesus literally walked to pray. Up on lonely mountains and in certain isolated wilderness places. Early in the morning, throughout the night even, alone sometimes with a few, even all of his disciples. You know, the Gospels make frequent mention of Jesus praying, enough that I think it's safe to say he prayed often, frequently withdrawing from the crowds. In fact, is one way of understanding Luke 5:16. He took time to give thanks, to pray before making major life decisions, when he needed to rest himself in God's care. He prayed when he was crippled with fear and in the face of a dear friend's death. You know, he wasn't unique in this. The practiced Jewish life has for many millennia been saturated in prayer. It still is. The first time that Karen and I flew to Israel, we sat in the very back of the plane amongst a lot of ultra-Orthodox Jews. And all throughout the flight, the men took turns standing up. They put their phylacteries on, they covered themselves with their prayer shawls, take their prayer books, and they would sway or daven in silent prayer. They stood in the aisles at the back of the plane, up against the center bulkhead walls, and there was nothing that was going to interrupt their prayers. If you needed to get past, it was just expected you just pushed your way past. And when the seatbelt light came on, there wasn't anything the flight attendants could say, even yell, to get them to sit down. The women, they prayed silently in the seats with their prayer books. You know, later on in Jerusalem, we saw very similar sights at the Kotel, or the Western Wall. In Jesus' day, as is the case today for Jews, there were set times and established prayers, as well as spontaneous thanksgiving offered throughout the day. Jesus would have learned to pray from his Father at the earliest age. At least 3 times a day, it is likely that he would have seen and heard and learned from Joseph to confess the Shema, which includes, but is a lot more than just the Deuteronomy 6:4, 5 part that we know. Hear, O Israel. It's also likely that he would have prayed through a series of prayers called the Amidah, the standing, or the Shemona Esra, literally the 18, now 19 prayers of blessing. These were formalized into a liturgy some 50 years after Jesus' death, but it's believed by scholars that they existed for hundreds of years before this, and even all the way back to the time of Nehemiah. From his earliest childhood, Jesus would have also seen and heard and learned from the adults around him to bless the Lord at least 100 times a day. You know, that may be what Paul was referring to or had in mind in his encouragement to pray without ceasing and in all circumstances to give thanks. It may have been how Jesus' own disciples would have heard him teach in a parable to the effect that they ought to always pray and never lose heart. Jesus clearly taught his disciples to pray through lessons and parables, but also by example. In fact, it was in a moment of his own praying in a certain place that his disciples said, "Lord, teach us to pray." Now, there are a lot of things that we can learn from this how-to prayer we call the Lord's Prayer that he taught them in response. I believe it is more a template than a liturgy. And in this devotion, I just want to focus on a few things that I'm finding important and challenging, especially in these days. First, Jesus teaches disciples to pray with an our-us identity. Our Father, give us today, forgive us, lead us. We tend to think of our lives far more often in our faith in personal terms. And you know, all too often this has us before God with just self-focused prayers, both in gratitude and request. One of the things I believe an our-us identity in prayer teaches us is to never seek our own fulfillment without considering our neighbor. In praying for our Father to give us our daily bread, is the lesson that it's not okay to pray that my needs be met and not be concerned with how any of the rest of us or our neighbors might be going hungry. Asking God to forgive us leads me away from merely hoping for my own forgiveness without offering the same grace to any who may have wronged me and sought forgiveness. Lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. It helps me not to think of my neighbor as evil. Maybe even teaches me how to love my enemy. Second, Jesus taught disciples that prayer needs to be centered in the character of God, not our own efforts or requests. Jesus both practiced and taught an approach to God in prayer as a beloved and caring Father whose character and will is good and also to be obeyed. He taught us both through example and lessons that prayer is both an intimate connection with God as our Father and the awesome holy wonder of bowing before this God who is the sovereign King of the universe. Our God whose name, meaning His honor and will, is to be hallowed, and whose kingdom rule is to shape our lives. Personally, we see Jesus crying out intimately to God in anguish even, and using the common language. In Mark 14:36, Abba, that's an Aramaic word. It's not the Hebrew of formal rabbinical teaching or Jewish liturgy. And yet in the same moment, we see Him utterly surrendered to God's sovereign will. Jesus taught disciples to rest their lives in trusting upon the honor and the character of God, trusting that God will provide the good we need to sustain us. When we read the parables that He used to teach on prayer, such as the woman who continues to petition, even harass the unrighteous judge, or the friend who needs bread in the middle of the night from a neighbor, it's important to recognize that Jesus is pointing to the character of God in these parables, not our efforts. The God that we are welcomed and encouraged to cry out to is the one who is utterly different than the judge who relents only after persistent bothering, or a neighbor who refuses a request simply because he wants to sleep. This is God who longs to fill us with Himself, bless us with His goodness and His glory. This is God, the God who Jesus prayed to often and intimately, surrendered and willingly, with thanksgiving, pleading, hope, and expectation. I confess, it is easy for me in these days to focus or dwell on all that feels broken, divisive, missing, lost. Refocusing on the honor, the character, the will of God, and on what there is to give thanks for, that's hard work. It takes reminders. It probably takes repetition, which is maybe one reason why Jews have for thousands of years had set times for prayer. Interruptions to the daily activities and struggles in order to say, Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu. Blessed are you, O Lord our God. For giving us work, food, friends, sun, rain, etc. For your holiness, your gracious care. For giving us everything necessary for life and godliness. Perhaps it is in such times, set times even, that we might best learn how to look for and offer up spontaneous thanksgivings. One other thing that I think is worth noting, and Jesus is teaching His disciples how to pray this template. He began by saying, and when you pray. When. Not if, when. When, that we might learn to set all our moments, our needs, our blessings, thanksgivings, our fears, our joys, our laments, our whole lives before and into the care of a loving Father. When, not if. Learning to place one another and our neighbors before our Father, our enemies, and pray. Shalom, church.